Welcome to Sci-Fi Alien, the channel where the unknown becomes our greatest adventure. Imagine a galaxy where secrets are buried so deep that the truth itself could shatter entire empires. What happens when humanity, once dismissed as insignificant, uncovers the darkest truth of an ancient, powerful race? What if everything you thought you knew about the galaxy, about the creatures who rule it, was based on lies? Join us as we dive into a story of betrayal, truth, and a fight for a future that no one could have predicted. Are you ready to uncover the secrets that could change everything? Stay with us. Humanity stood at the crossroads of its future. Once an underdog in the vast expanse of the galaxy, humankind had spent centuries clawing its way into the cosmos, battling against forces far more advanced, with technologies and cultures that dwarfed anything Earth had ever known. And yet, despite all the strides we had made in space exploration, faster than light travel, and biotechnology, we were still seen as inferior, a mere footnote in the grand history of the universe. The first time we walked into the Galactic Council's chambers, we were nothing more than a curiosity, a passing whim among the galaxy's most powerful and ancient species. Among them, the Valorians stood as titans, their civilization stretching over 50,000 years, each one of their victories etched into the stars. They were the proud architects of galactic order, the self-proclaimed keepers of peace and dominion. To them, humanity was a joke, a fleeting species that had barely scraped together the technology to venture beyond their own planet. We were the young ones, fumbling in the dark, trying to catch up to the wisdom and power of the galaxy's true rulers. The moment we entered that hallowed hall, it felt as though the air itself thickened with the weight of their mockery. The grandiose Valorian architecture loomed overhead, all towering spires and shining crystal, while the human delegates seemed almost comically small in their environment suits, their every breath a reminder of how ill-equipped we were to even survive among them. The Valorian leaders, seated high upon their thrones, exchanged knowing glances, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of condescension and amusement. The laughter of the council echoed through the hall, sharp and derisive. It wasn't just the words that cut deep, but the certainty in their tone, the absolute belief that we had no place here, that we were merely a speck in the vastness of the galaxy. High Commissioner Valor, the embodiment of Valorian pride, stood before us like a figure carved from stone. His iridescent scales shimmered with barely contained amusement as he looked down at our small delegation, our feet clad in cumbersome environmental suits, and our faces obscured behind transparent helmets. He didn't need to speak at first, his gaze alone spoke volumes. In that moment, we weren't even worth his time, not until he chose to deign us with words. "What makes you think," Valor's voice rang out, his tone rich with disdain, "that your species deserves a seat at this council? You can barely survive in our atmosphere." The Valorians in the chamber chittered with laughter, their bioluminescent markings pulsing in synchronized amusement. The sound was almost melodic, but it was hollow, a reminder that in the eyes of the Valorians, we were less than insignificant. Each of their words stung like a slap to the face. We had heard these kinds of dismissals before, on Earth, in our own history, when we were the underdogs fighting for recognition. But this was different. This wasn't just a battle for respect among humans. This was about our very place in the universe, a universe that seemed to have no room for a species so young, so new, so unpolished. Yet, we had come here with purpose, with more than just our technology to back us. Ambassador Roland Martinez, our representative, stood tall, his spine straight, despite the weight of the mockery in the air. The servos in his suit creaked in protest as he adjusted his posture, but he refused to let the Valorians see his unease. In that moment, the very core of humanity's spirit was on display. We may not have the centuries of experience that the Valorians had, but we had something more powerful: resolve. With a calm, measured voice, Martinez spoke. "With all due respect, High Commissioner," he began, his words echoing through the chamber, "humanity has achieved faster than light travel in less than 300 years since discovering electricity. Our rate of technological advancement proves we are more than capable of contributing to the future of this galaxy. We are not the primitives you seem to think us." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, and the laughter that had echoed moments before died in an instant. Valor's eyes narrowed slightly, the challenge in Martinez's words evident. He wasn't used to being defied, especially by a species he deemed so unworthy. The silence that followed stretched on, heavy and thick, before Valor finally spoke again. His voice was tinged with condescension but tempered by something else, perhaps a reluctant curiosity. "Ah, yes," Valor said, his voice dripping with irony, "but your technological achievements are nothing more than a desperate rush to catch up, are they not? Your so-called advancements in biotechnology, artificial intelligence. They are crude attempts at what we perfected eons ago." The council responded with a ripple of laughter, but this time, it lacked its previous confidence. It was more of a nervous chuckle, as though the Valorians were trying to mask their growing discomfort. They had underestimated us, something they never thought would happen. But we were no longer the species scrambling in the shadows, trying to survive. We had proven our worth in the most unexpected of ways. Your quantum mechanics, Martinez countered, were perfected while your ancestors were still throwing spears at each other. We've contributed significant advances to the galaxy already, in biotechnology and AI, advances that you've benefited from, whether you care to admit it or not. For a fleeting moment, the Valorian leaders seemed uncertain, as though the words had pierced through the layers of their arrogance. They were accustomed to seeing other species as lesser, unable to understand how anyone, especially humanity, could come to challenge their dominance. But they hadn't expected us to stand firm, to challenge them not with our weapons or our technology, but with the truth. In the silence that followed, Dr. Maya Blackwood, standing by Martinez's side, felt a surge of hope. This was our moment, she realized. The Valorians might have thought us insignificant, but we were no longer willing to be overlooked. We were ready to fight for our place, not with violence or war, but with knowledge, with unity, and with an unyielding belief in our potential. The mockery had faded, replaced by a shift in the Valorians' gaze. Something had changed. They were no longer looking down on us. Instead, they were beginning to see us, not as children fumbling in the dark, but as equals. For the first time, they were beginning to question their assumptions about us. And that, Dr. Blackwood realized, was the beginning of something far greater than they could have ever anticipated. In the end, we weren't just here to survive. We were here to thrive, and to prove that humanity had earned its place at the table, not through strength alone, but through determination, intelligence, and a shared belief in the possibility of something greater than ourselves. We were ready to step into the galaxy's future, not as a joke, but as a force to be reckoned with. The Valorians may have laughed at us at first, but they wouldn't be laughing for much longer. In the face of mockery, humanity did not cower. There was no retreat, no fear in our hearts, only the quiet, steady fire that had burned in our species since our earliest days. Standing before the Galactic Council, with its towering, intimidating figures and its ancient history, we could have easily bowed our heads, allowing their laughter to drown us. But we did not. This was not a moment of submission, it was a moment of reckoning, a time to prove that humanity was not just a fleeting presence in the galaxy, but a force that had earned its place. Ambassador Roland Martinez felt the weight of the room on his shoulders, yet his stance remained unwavering. The air was thick with condescension, each sneer from the Valorian delegates like a barb meant to break our resolve. The High Commissioner Valor, in all his regal glory, stood at the center, his piercing gaze scanning the human delegation as if we were nothing more than insects beneath his feet. His words stung, but they didn't deter us. In fact, they did the opposite. They fueled the conviction that had been simmering within humanity for centuries. Your species has achieved nothing of consequence, Valor's voice boomed, dismissing our entire existence with a wave of his hand. Your technology is a crutch, your mind's too young to comprehend the true power of the galaxy. What makes you think you deserve a seat at this council? The laughter that followed was not just from Valor, but from the Valorian representatives seated around him. It echoed through the chamber, mocking our very presence. The sound was like a wave crashing over us, drowning out our pride and our purpose. Yet, instead of shrinking in the face of it, something stirred deep inside us. This was not the moment to back down. This was the moment to rise. Martinez took a slow, deliberate step forward, his every movement calculated, purposeful. His voice rang out across the chamber, cutting through the laughter like a blade. With all due respect, High Commissioner, he said, his tone firm, his gaze unwavering, humanity has achieved faster than light travel in less than 3 centuries. We've made strides that no species in this galaxy thought possible in such a short time. His words were not just a statement, they were a challenge. A bold, defiant declaration that humanity was here, not to ask for permission, but to claim its rightful place in the galactic conversation. We had spent centuries on the edge, peering into the stars, yearning to understand them. And now, finally, we were being heard. Martinez's words were the voice of every human who had ever been told they were not good enough, every person who had been looked down upon for simply being human. It was our declaration, not of war, but of existence. Yes, he continued, his gaze sweeping the chamber, meeting the eyes of the Valorians who looked down at us with disdain, we have barely begun, but our rate of technological advancement speaks for itself. In just a few centuries, we have done what no other species in the galaxy has done, gone from survival to thriving. Our contribution to artificial intelligence and biotechnology alone has already changed the galactic landscape. And yet, we are dismissed as children in the dark. There was a pause. The laughter from the Valorians slowed, faltering as they began to process the weight of Martinez's words. It wasn't just the facts that rang true, but the quiet confidence behind them. Humans were no longer scrambling to catch up. We had already caught up, and we were now poised to leap ahead. High Commissioner Valor's gaze narrowed as he considered Martinez's words, his fingers twitching slightly as if contemplating the significance of this challenge. He had not expected this. He had assumed that the humans would bow to the weight of their superiority, that they would cower in silence, acknowledging their place beneath the Valorian Empire. But here was something different. Here was a species that had been underestimated, and yet, now stood before them, unshaken. You speak of advances, of technology, Valor said, his voice growing colder. But your efforts are crude at best. Your attempts at mastering the galaxy are little more than desperate measures. You speak of biotechnology and artificial intelligence, yes, but your efforts are still in their infancy. You can barely understand the consequences of your actions, much less the true potential of what you are attempting. There was no anger in his voice, no rage. Just a calm, detached superiority, as if he were speaking to a child who didn't understand the complexities of the world. It was as if he believed that the weight of history, the thousands of years of knowledge and power that Valorians carried, would be enough to crush any challenge, any threat, posed by humanity. But what Valor failed to grasp was that humanity's greatest strength was not just in our technology or our inventions, it was in our determination. We did not see the galaxy as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood. Our advances were not born out of a desire to dominate, but out of a deep curiosity, a drive to learn, to explore, to make things better not just for ourselves, but for all sentient beings. And that was something the Valorians could never understand. Martinez, standing at the forefront of humanity's challenge, responded not with anger, but with calm confidence. Our advancements may be young, yes. But they are ours, created by our hands, and our minds. We are not here to compete with you for superiority. We are here to grow, to learn, and to share what we've discovered with the galaxy. And that is something we intend to do, for everyone, not just for ourselves. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air for a moment longer than necessary, the silence in the room thick with a tension that was almost tangible. Valor's expression shifted slightly, his eyes betraying the slightest hint of unease. He had expected humans to shrink under the weight of their inferiority, to apologize for their presence and ask for permission to join the Galactic Council. What he did not expect was humanity's refusal to bow, to instead rise and meet him head-on, not with violence or arrogance, but with something far more potent, belief. The Valorians, long accustomed to holding the upper hand, suddenly found themselves confronted with a species that was not just looking for a seat at the table. Humanity wasn't asking for permission anymore. We were demanding a place among the stars, not because of our power, but because of our unwavering belief in the potential we had yet to unlock. And with that belief, we had struck a chord, a note that resonated through the halls of the council, one that Valor and the other Valorians could no longer ignore. This wasn't the beginning of a war. It wasn't the beginning of a battle of wits or strength. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the galaxy's history. And this time, humanity would write its own story, not as the underdog, but as a force to be reckoned with. In the silence that followed, something shifted, not just in the chamber, but in the universe itself. Humanity had taken its first step forward, and for the first time, the galaxy began to look at us not with mockery, but with something far more dangerous, respect. The chamber had grown heavy with silence after Ambassador Martinez's bold declaration, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. The laughter had ceased, but the tension was palpable, thick with an unspoken question: could humanity really stand among the stars as equals to the galaxy's ancient and most powerful species? The Valorians, proud and imposing, had always believed themselves to be the epitome of civilization, the pinnacle of intellect and power. And yet, there was something in the way the humans stood, their heads held high despite the weight of centuries pressing down on them, that made the room feel charged with something new, something uncertain. Then, just as the air seemed to hold its breath, Dr. Maya Blackwood, an unassuming linguist by profession, stepped forward. She had been quiet, standing at the edge of the gathering, her gaze not focused on the grandeur of the Valorian assembly but instead on the old, ancient symbols that had been carved into the chamber's walls, symbols that no one had dared to decipher for thousands of years. She had long suspected that there was something more to the Valorians' ancient history, something buried in their language, something that connected them to the forgotten past of the galaxy. But this moment, this feeling in the air, brought it all together. Maya had been working for months, poring over ancient texts, relics, and artifacts that humans had discovered across the galaxy. Her research into Valorian language had always been more of a quiet pursuit, an academic exercise, a curiosity. But now, standing at the precipice of this historic confrontation, something within her clicked. She had always believed that language was the key, that the Valorians' past, hidden beneath layers of pride and arrogance, held the answers to their true origins. The truth had been buried for too long, suppressed in favor of their carefully constructed narrative of superiority. Without thinking, she reached into her pouch and pulled out a small, worn tablet. It was ancient, its surface cracked, but to her, it was a key to unlocking something far more significant than anyone could have imagined. She turned the tablet over in her hands, the script on it barely visible under the light. The symbols were strange, almost alien, but to Maya, they felt eerily familiar. This was no random relic. This was something more. Something alive. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't seek approval from the Valorians or the human delegation. Maya stepped forward, her voice steady but resonating with an urgency that only she could feel. She began to speak, softly at first, but then with increasing confidence. The words that flowed from her lips were not human, they were not even Valorian. They were the language of the dead, the forgotten language of a civilization lost to time. For a moment, the room held its breath as the words echoed through the vast chamber. The air itself seemed to tremble with the resonance of her voice, the words she spoke vibrating through the very walls. The Valorians, at first frozen in shock, seemed to blink in disbelief, their eyes wide with something akin to fear, something they had never expected from us. The Valorians, with all their wisdom and ancient knowledge, had always prided themselves on being the most advanced species in the galaxy. They had explored the stars long before humanity had even dreamt of venturing into the dark. Their technology was unparalleled, their history rich with the accomplishments of millennia. But in this moment, the very foundation of their belief in their superiority began to crack. For Maya had not just spoken a language, she had spoken the language of their ancestors, a language long thought to be lost forever. The effect was instantaneous. The Valorians' regal composure faltered, their expressions shifting from disbelief to something closer to fear. High Commissioner Valor, who had once looked at us with nothing but disdain, now stood silent, his gaze fixated on Maya. He didn't speak immediately, but his eyes betrayed something, a flicker of recognition. The chamber, once filled with the hum of Valorian chatter and the laughter of the elite, was now eerily silent, the only sound the echo of Maya's words. It was in that moment that Maya understood what she had unlocked. The Valorians had always believed they were the pinnacle of creation, the great architects of the galaxy's order. They had long hidden their past, refused to acknowledge their origins. But Maya had uncovered the truth. The language she had spoken was the missing link between humanity and the Valorians, a bridge that connected us in ways we had never imagined. It wasn't just the words she had spoken. It was the very resonance of them, a vibration that traveled deeper than language itself, stirring something ancient in the Valorians, something they had buried deep within their collective psyche. For the first time, the Valorians felt vulnerable. The masks they had worn for centuries, hiding their true history, their true beginnings, were slipping away. They had never intended for anyone, least of all humans, to unlock the secrets of their past. They had never wanted the galaxy to know that they were not the superior race they had claimed to be. They had hidden the truth of their origins, the truth that tied them to a species they had destroyed in their quest for dominance. But now, that truth was laid bare in the words Maya spoke. The dead language of their ancestors was not just a relic, it was the key to understanding their history, their culture, and their deepest secrets. The Valorians had never truly been alone in the galaxy. They had shared their existence with another, a species of equal intelligence, equal potential. But in their arrogance, they had destroyed that species, erasing the evidence of their shared past, burying it beneath a veil of lies. As the last of Maya's words echoed through the chamber, the silence was broken, not by the Valorians, but by the humans. They looked at each other, at the Valorians, and they realized the enormity of what had just happened. The laughter had stopped. The mockery had ceased. And now, for the first time, the galaxy's most powerful species were looking at us, not as inferiors, not as the primitive race, but as equals. The truth was undeniable. Humanity had spoken the language that the Valorians had long hidden from the galaxy, and in doing so, had revealed the most profound secret of their past. The Valorians were not the sole survivors of a glorious civilization. They were survivors of a terrible war, a war they had waged against a species they had destroyed, and in doing so, they had buried the truth. The truth that humanity, against all odds, had just uncovered. High Commissioner Valor's silence spoke volumes. The Valorians had not expected this moment. They had never imagined that humanity would not only survive but thrive, uncovering the very essence of their civilization's darkest secret. It wasn't just the language Maya spoke, it was the courage to speak it, the courage to challenge the established order and expose the truth. And in that moment, humanity had not only proven our worth, we had proven that we would no longer be silenced, no longer be the ones looked down upon. We were now the bearers of a truth that would forever change the galaxy, and there was nothing the Valorians could do to erase it. The moment the last of Maya's words faded into the tense silence, the weight of the discovery began to settle like a dense fog across the chamber. The Valorians, so accustomed to holding the reins of the galaxy's power, stood still, their poised expressions cracking under the weight of an undeniable truth. High Commissioner Valor, who had once towered over humanity with disdain, now found himself tethered to an uncomfortable reality. His eyes, once sharp with pride, now bore the faintest trace of something new, fear. It wasn't the fear of violence or warfare, not the kind of fear a soldier might feel before battle, but a deeper, more existential kind of dread. The kind that comes when the foundation of everything you believed about yourself, your race, your entire existence begins to crumble. Valor had been the embodiment of Valorian supremacy, the symbol of an empire that had cast its shadow over the galaxy for millennia. To him, the Valorians were the architects of order, the rightful rulers of the stars. And for that long stretch of history, they had been untouchable. Until now. The room felt like it was holding its breath as Valor slowly turned his gaze toward Maya. The sound of his steps echoed in the silence as he moved toward the center of the chamber, his presence commanding the attention of all in the room. But this time, his voice lacked the authority it once held. It was quieter, laced with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "What you've done, what you've uncovered," his voice faltered before he could finish the sentence. The High Commissioner's usual grandeur was gone, replaced with something raw and exposed, as if a veil had been lifted from his very soul. Maya, still standing at the edge of the room, her heart racing with a mix of triumph and dread, locked eyes with Valor. The weight of the moment hung between them like a fragile thread, one that could snap at any moment. She had expected this reaction, but nothing could have prepared her for the depth of emotion she saw in the High Commissioner's eyes. There was no anger, no rage, only an overwhelming sense of regret, as if the reality of his people's dark history had finally caught up with him. Valor exhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what was coming. "The language you've spoken, those words, are not just any ancient dialect," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with great care. They are the language of the ancestors of my people, a language we thought had long since died. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the walls of the council chamber, as though searching for answers in the very stones around him. It is a language that connects us to a past we've spent millennia trying to forget. The words hit Maya with a force she hadn't anticipated. She had always suspected there was more to the Valorians' history than they let on, but to hear Valor, the very embodiment of their empire, admit it so openly was another matter entirely. The weight of this revelation was not just about the language, it was about the legacy of violence and suppression that had shaped the Valorians' rise to power. For the first time, Maya understood the depth of their fear. Valor's people had built their empire on a foundation of secrecy and lies, burying the truth of their violent past so deeply that they had come to believe it no longer mattered. But now, in the face of Maya's discovery, the truth had returned to the surface, and it could no longer be ignored. The Valorians were not always the rulers of this galaxy, Valor continued, his voice softening with the weight of his confession. We were once part of a greater civilization, a civilization that was destroyed long before we even knew what we had. Our ancestors were not the first, nor the only, to walk the stars. We were given our place in the galaxy not by our own power, but by the remnants of an ancient species, an alien race whose knowledge and technology we inherited after we wiped them out. The room seemed to close in around Maya as she processed his words. The Valorians, so proud, so confident in their superiority, were not the true founders of their empire. They had inherited it, built it on the bones of a species they had destroyed. They had taken what they wanted, and in the process, they had erased the history of those they had killed. The galaxy had been told a lie for millennia, and now the truth was flooding into the open, unbidden, and unstoppable. Valor's voice wavered as he continued, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. We thought we could bury it all, bury the truth of what we did to that civilization. We erased every trace of their existence from our records, convinced that if we could forget, then perhaps the galaxy would too. But you found it? He looked up at Maya, his expression torn between admiration and regret. You found the truth we've kept hidden for so long. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as the enormity of the situation settled in. The Valorians were not the noble beings they had claimed to be. They were survivors of a war they had waged, against a species far older and more powerful than they had ever been. And in their desperation for survival, they had destroyed the very people who had given them the knowledge and power to thrive. You've been hiding this for millennia, Maya said, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. The galaxy, my people, we've all been living in the shadow of a lie. You've erased the truth of your past, but the truth can't be hidden forever. Valor's eyes darkened with a sadness that seemed to span eons. We never wanted the galaxy to know what we did, he whispered, the words barely audible. We feared what would happen if the truth came to light, what the galaxy would think of us, of our empire. We feared that if the truth was exposed, everything we've built would collapse. And perhaps it should. The room was deathly silent as Valor's words hung in the air. The Valorians, who had once looked down upon humanity, now found themselves face to face with the consequences of their actions. The High Commissioner's revelation had shattered the carefully crafted image of their race. The truth, once buried beneath layers of pride and arrogance, had finally come to light. Maya, standing before him, realized that this was not just about the language they had discovered. It was about something much larger, the courage to face the past, to confront the dark truths that shaped the present. Valor's people had been living in the shadow of their own history for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to be honest, to be vulnerable. But now, With the truth laid bare, they had no choice but to confront the reality of their actions. "We can't erase the past," Valor said, his voice barely a whisper. "But we can choose what we do with it from here. And perhaps it's time for the galaxy to know who we really are." In that moment, Maya understood. This wasn't just the fall of the Valorian Empire. This was the beginning of something new, a chance for redemption, for healing. For the first time in their history, the Valorians had a choice, to continue living in the shadow of their lies, or to step into the light and face the truth, no matter the cost. The room remained silent, but in that silence, the future of the galaxy was being rewritten. The High Commissioner had revealed the darkness of his people's past, but with that revelation came the possibility of something greater, a future where honesty, reconciliation, and understanding could pave the way for a new era. And for humanity, that was the ultimate victory. As the echoes of Valor's confession faded into the stillness of the chamber, a profound silence enveloped the room. The truth had been laid bare, but it was only the beginning of understanding the full depth of the revelation. The Valorians, long considered the paragons of galactic civilization, had never imagined that their carefully constructed mythos would crumble so easily. The truth of their origin, so long buried beneath layers of pride and arrogance, had been unearthed, and in the process, everything they had worked to protect seemed to be slipping through their fingers. For millennia, the Valorians had sold themselves as the rightful rulers of the galaxy, the chosen species who had ascended to greatness through intellect, strength, and divine providence. Their empire stretched across countless star systems, their technological achievements unparalleled, their cultural legacy seemingly flawless. They were the epitome of what the galaxy had always strived to become. No one had ever questioned their position at the top of the galactic hierarchy. But that was before humanity came into the fold, before the ancient language was spoken, before the truth could no longer be ignored. The Valorians had been lying, not just to the galaxy, but to themselves. Theirs was not a history of divine ascension, but one of survival, built on bloodshed and betrayal. Valor's words had exposed the painful reality: the Valorians were not the architects of their own destiny. They had been the beneficiaries of a terrible tragedy, the inheritors of a civilization that they had destroyed. The very foundation of their empire had been constructed on the ruins of a once great species that had been wiped out in a violent, catastrophic war. This truth, now revealed, was a heavy burden for the Valorians to bear. It was not just the weight of their past that weighed on them, but the realization that they had spent so long denying it, hiding from it, that they had forgotten how to face it. For centuries, they had erased every trace of the species they had slaughtered, convinced that by doing so, they could rewrite history. They had convinced themselves that their dominance was earned, that they had earned their place as the galaxy's leaders. And for so long, they had been right. No one had questioned them, no one had dared to look beneath the surface of their shiny empire. But now that the truth was out, the Valorians were confronted with something they had tried so hard to suppress: the haunting legacy of their own actions. The species they had destroyed was not some distant, nameless enemy, it was a species with knowledge, wisdom, and a legacy of its own, a species that had given the Valorians the tools to rise to power, only to be crushed underfoot when they were no longer needed. In the silence that followed Valor's words, Dr. Blackwood felt a deep, gnawing sorrow. This wasn't just about a betrayal of another species, it was about the cost of power, the price of survival. She had suspected, even before she uncovered the ancient language, that the Valorians were not as pure as they seemed. But the scale of their deception, the lengths to which they had gone to bury their history, was far more than she could have imagined. The Valorians had not only wiped out a species, they had erased their very connection to their own humanity. In their pursuit of power, they had abandoned any sense of honor or empathy, choosing instead to bury the truth in favor of maintaining their dominance. And now, with the truth exposed, they were left to confront the terrible cost of that decision. For Valor, the High Commissioner who had stood as the symbol of Valorian supremacy, the weight of this revelation was unbearable. He had been born into a system that taught him that the Valorians were the galaxy's rightful rulers, that their greatness was earned through their strength and intelligence. He had believed it, as had every Valorian before him. But now, faced with the undeniable evidence of their past, he realized that their greatness had been built on a lie. And that lie had haunted them for generations. Valor's gaze shifted downward as the full weight of his people's history settled over him. The Valorians had always prided themselves on their intelligence, on their ability to understand the universe and shape it to their will. But what they had never understood was the cost of their rise to power. They had destroyed a species, one with knowledge, with the potential to rival their own, and in doing so, they had doomed themselves to a future of denial and repression. For how could a species that had committed such atrocities ever truly call itself great? The truth of the Valorians' origin wasn't just a painful reminder of their violent past, it was a reckoning. And it was one that Valor, standing at the helm of the Valorian Empire, was now forced to confront. The question he had spent his life avoiding, "What are we truly?" had been answered, but the answer was far from what he had expected. For the first time in his life, Valor felt something he had never felt before: shame. It wasn't a feeling that his people had ever allowed themselves to entertain. To be Valorian was to be beyond reproach, to be above judgment. But now, standing in the presence of humanity, in the presence of those who had dared to challenge them, he realized that his people were not as untouchable as they had once believed. The galaxy's respect for the Valorians was not built on truth, but on a carefully constructed illusion, an illusion that had now shattered. Maya watched as Valor struggled with the enormity of what he had revealed. She could see the internal battle playing out in his eyes, the conflict between the proud leader of an empire and the truth that threatened to tear that empire apart. The High Commissioner was a man who had lived his entire life believing in the righteousness of his people, the greatness of their past. And now, that belief had been shattered. The silence in the room stretched on, each moment heavier than the last. The truth of the Valorians' history hung in the air like a dark cloud, one that could never be ignored again. The future of the Valorians, and of the galaxy itself, had just been irrevocably altered. Valor's voice, when it finally came, was quieter than before, almost resigned. We thought that by forgetting, by erasing the past, we could shape a better future. But now, the past is here, staring us in the face. His eyes met Maya's, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in them, only a quiet, painful understanding. We cannot undo what we've done. But perhaps it is time to build a future where the truth is no longer hidden. The weight of his words, spoken not as a command but as a tentative plea for redemption, hung in the air. For the first time, Valor was not asking for forgiveness. He was asking for a chance to make things right. The galaxy had just learned the truth about the Valorians, the truth about their violent rise to power, their betrayal of an ancient species, and the legacy that had shaped them. But it was not the end. It was only the beginning. The question now was whether the Valorians would rise from the ashes of their past, or whether they would be consumed by the very lies they had spent so long protecting. Dr. Maya Blackwood stood frozen in the aftermath of the High Commissioner's confession, her heart pounding in her chest. The chamber around her seemed to blur, the walls, once imposing with their grandiose design, now felt suffocating, closing in on her as the weight of what had just been revealed pressed down upon her. She had come into this moment with a quiet curiosity, driven by an academic passion for understanding the ancient and forgotten languages of the galaxy, but what she had uncovered was far beyond anything she could have imagined. The Valorians were not the perfect, noble race they had claimed to be. They were survivors, but survivors of a war they had waged to erase the very species that had once helped them. Her mind raced, trying to process the enormity of the truth. The Valorians had buried their past, choosing to rewrite their history in a way that suited their ego and their claim to superiority. They had destroyed an entire civilization and then built their empire upon the ashes, hiding the evidence of their violent rise to power under layers of lies and silence. The galaxy had believed in the myth of their greatness for millennia, and now, in a single moment, that myth had been shattered. But as Maya's shock began to subside, a new, stronger emotion started to take its place: determination. She had never thought she would find herself in the middle of such a monumental moment in galactic history. She had always been a researcher, a scholar, someone content to unearth long-forgotten languages and trace the evolution of ancient civilizations. But this wasn't just about uncovering facts. This was about confronting an empire built on lies. This was about exposing a truth that had been hidden for far too long, and doing so in a way that could change the very course of the galaxy. The Valorians, for all their pride and arrogance, were now vulnerable. The truth was no longer buried in dusty archives or sealed away in ancient texts. It was out in the open, and it could not be ignored. And while she had expected Valor's revelation to be a painful one, the weight of it was far greater than she had anticipated. For a moment, she almost felt sympathy for the High Commissioner. He had spent his entire life upholding a lie so vast and so deeply ingrained in his people's identity that he had never questioned it. Now, that lie was exposed, and he was left to deal with the consequences. Maya's breath steadied as she looked up from the floor, her gaze meeting Valor's. The man who had once stood above her, dismissing her and her people as insignificant, was now looking at her not with contempt, but with something different, perhaps, for the first time in his life, with the recognition that humanity had a place here. He had revealed his people's darkest secret, and in doing so, he had forced himself to confront everything that had made him, and the Valorians, who they were. It was a painful moment, and Maya understood it. But she also understood that the galaxy could not afford to let this moment pass quietly into the past. This truth was too important. It was too crucial to be forgotten. The silence between them felt heavy, but Maya knew that there was no turning back. The Valorians had made their choices, and now it was humanity's turn to decide what kind of future they wanted to build. She stepped forward, her voice steady, though her heart was still racing. "You've revealed your history, Valor," she said, her words cutting through the tension. "But the truth isn't something you can bury again. What you've done, what your people have done, cannot be erased." Valor's eyes, which had once glimmered with the assurance of superiority, now seemed dimmed with the weight of his confession. His expression was no longer one of arrogance, but of something much more fragile: regret. And yet, Maya could see it, he was still holding on to something. There was still a part of him that wanted to protect the Valorians, to preserve their empire, despite the truth that had just been exposed. "We did what we had to do," Valor said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We survived. That was all that mattered. In the end, isn't that what any species would do?" Maya met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "You survived?" "Yes," she said, her voice firm with the conviction she had always carried deep inside her. "But at what cost? You didn't just survive, you destroyed. You erased a people. You buried their knowledge, their legacy, and in doing so, you lost part of yourselves. You can't just call this survival. This was a choice. The truth of her words rang out in the chamber, reverberating through the silence like a call to action. She had known from the moment she first uncovered the ancient symbols that this was not just a linguistic discovery. It was a turning point. The Valorians could no longer hide behind their facade of invincibility, and neither could humanity. We had seen their darkness, and now it was our responsibility to decide what we would do with that knowledge. Would we let it fester in the shadows, or would we take it and build something better, something brighter, from the ashes of their deception? Maya took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto Valor's once again. You may think that your people are too far gone to change, but the galaxy doesn't have to stay the way it's been. The truth is out now. You can't control it. You can't hide from it anymore. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. But that doesn't mean it's too late to do something about it. We can help you rebuild. But you have to stop hiding. You have to face the past, own it, learn from it, and move forward. The galaxy won't forgive what's been done, but it will remember what we choose to do with this moment. It will remember if we take the first step toward redemption. For a long moment, Valor remained silent, his eyes staring at Maya with an intensity that she could not quite decipher. The weight of her words hung between them, but she could see that he was processing, thinking, struggling to reconcile what he had always known with the reality that had just been exposed. The Valorians had lived their lives believing that power was their right, that their empire was invincible. But in that moment, Maya knew that Valor, and perhaps even the Valorians as a whole, were beginning to see the cracks in that belief. As the silence stretched on, Maya felt a sense of clarity wash over her. The road ahead would not be easy. It would be fraught with resistance, with uncertainty, and with fear. But for the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time to decide what to do with it. And she would not stand idly by as history repeated itself. Maya turned away from Valor, her mind already racing ahead to the future. There was work to be done, and the stakes had never been higher. But she knew one thing for certain: humanity had a place in the galaxy, not as the underdog, but as the voice of truth, the catalyst for change. And she would not rest until the galaxy understood that. The weight of Valor's revelation hung heavily in the air, settling like dust over the chamber. Maya stood still, processing the magnitude of the truth they had just uncovered. The Valorians were not the benevolent rulers they had claimed to be, they were the inheritors of a dark past, shaped by betrayal and violence. The empire they had built, the peace they had so carefully cultivated, was built on lies, lies that had been carefully crafted over millennia to hide the sins of their ancestors. The truth had been revealed, but the weight of it was more than anyone had anticipated. The revelation was far from over. Maya had expected some level of resistance, perhaps even anger, from Valor and his people. What she had not expected, however, was what happened next, something far darker, far more insidious than she could have ever imagined. As the silence lingered in the room, a low hum filled the air. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, a vibration that seemed to reverberate through the very floor beneath their feet. Then, without warning, the chamber doors slammed shut with a force that echoed throughout the hall, reverberating off the high, vaulted walls. The Valorians, those towering, proud figures who had once looked down on humanity, shifted, their eyes darting nervously, and Maya's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. This wasn't the planned council session anymore. This wasn't the official diplomacy they had entered into. There was a tension in the air now, a palpable shift in the mood. The Valorians were hiding something more, something that had been lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Maya's thoughts raced. She had thought this was the moment of truth, the beginning of a new era where the Valorians would face their past, confront the truth, and rebuild. But instead, something felt off. Valor's face had grown taut, his brow furrowing as he glanced nervously around the room. His earlier vulnerability was now replaced with something colder, more calculating. Maya's intuition screamed at her that this wasn't over, that the Valorians weren't done yet. Without warning, the chamber's central holographic display flickered to life, casting a cold, blue light across the room. The once proud High Commissioner Valor's voice echoed out, but it was different now. There was no longer the quiet remorse or the recognition of past wrongs. Instead, his voice rang out with a sharp, commanding authority, one that sent a chill down Maya's spine. Dr. Blackwood, Ambassador Martinez, and the rest of the human delegation, Valor's voice cut through the tension, I regret to inform you that our discussion here has come to an end. You have all been misled. What you thought was the beginning of our truth is nothing more than a calculated diversion. Maya's breath caught in her throat. A diversion? This was not the confession she had imagined. This was not the moment of reconciliation she had hoped for. She turned sharply to Martinez, but the realization began to set in that they were not just dealing with a history of violence and secrecy. They were facing something much more dangerous, a betrayal that had been carefully orchestrated from the very beginning. The hologram shifted, revealing a new set of symbols, a sequence of codes Maya recognized from her research, codes that had once been dismissed as meaningless, irrelevant fragments. But now, in the context of this moment, they made sense. It wasn't just an ancient language they had uncovered. It was a signal, a hidden message embedded within the Valorian archives, a message that had been intentionally left for humanity to find, but one that had been meant to lead them into a trap. Maya's heart raced. This wasn't the truth they had hoped to expose. This was an elaborate scheme, a deception so deep that it made everything that had come before it feel like a mere diversion. The Valorians had set a trap, and they had played their hand far better than anyone had realized. They had allowed humanity to uncover just enough of the past, just enough of the truth, to lure them in, to make them feel as though they had gained some kind of victory. But in doing so, they had led them into a carefully crafted snare. Martinez stepped forward, his voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and anger. What is this, Valor? What game are you playing here? You told us the truth. You told us the truth. Valor's cold smile was almost imperceptible, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface, like a snake waiting to strike. The truth, Ambassador, is not what you think it is. You have only seen what we wanted you to see. And now, you've played your part. The words hit Maya like a physical blow. This was no longer just about the Valorians and their dark past. This was about something far more insidious, manipulation. The Valorians had never truly intended to expose their history, they had meant to use it. They had woven a web of lies so intricate that it had ensnared them all, including the humans who thought they were uncovering the truth. The message, the so-called revelation, had all been carefully crafted to serve a purpose, one that was only now becoming clear. The chamber doors, which had been slammed shut earlier, suddenly slid open again, but this time, it was not a simple release. A new set of guards, heavily armed, their weapons gleaming with deadly energy, stepped inside, blocking any escape. Maya's pulse quickened as she realized that their discovery had triggered something far more dangerous than they could have anticipated. They were no longer guests at a diplomatic summit. They were prisoners in a chamber that had been sealed off by the very people who had seemed so eager to make amends. "We can no longer allow you to leave," Valor said, his voice cold and measured. "The truth you uncovered was never meant for your eyes. You have exposed more than we intended, and now, you must pay the price for your curiosity." Maya's mind spun. Betrayal, deceit, and manipulation, it all came crashing down on her. The Valorians had led them into a trap. They had played them, using their own desire for truth as bait to ensnare them. This wasn't a simple political maneuver. This was an assassination of trust, a calculated strike against the very foundation of humanity's belief that they could ever be seen as equals in the galaxy. Martinez clenched his fists, his face hardening with resolve. "You will not get away with this, Valor. This will not be the end of us. You can try to silence us, but you cannot stop the truth from coming out." Valor's expression remained unchanged, but the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes betrayed something deeper: fear. Fear of what they had done, fear of what would happen now that the deception had been revealed. But it was too late. The trap had been set, and now they were all caught in it. The betrayal was not just one of deception, it was one of desperation. Valor and the Valorians had known that the truth would eventually come out, and in a twisted move, they had chosen to manipulate that truth to their advantage, to control the narrative and keep the galaxy's power structures intact. But in their attempt to control the situation, they had only exposed their vulnerability. They had underestimated humanity's ability to fight back, to refuse to be manipulated, and to rise from the depths of deceit. And so, in that moment, as the Valorians tightened their grip on the human delegation, Maya's heart hardened with a new resolve. This was no longer just about uncovering secrets. This was about survival. This was about resisting the forces that sought to keep humanity down, to silence the truth, and to continue their reign of deception. Maya and the rest of the human delegation would not allow themselves to be silenced, not now, not ever. The tension in the room was suffocating, as though the very air itself had thickened with the weight of an impossible decision. High Commissioner Valor's gaze locked onto Dr. Maya Blackwood, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating resolve that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty that had plagued him moments before. What had started as an open, raw confession had now taken a darker turn, with the Valorians showing their true colors once again, a race not content with merely keeping their secrets hidden, but willing to go to any lengths to preserve their power. The truth they had so reluctantly revealed was now at risk of being buried forever, unless Maya and the human delegation made a choice that would seal their fate. The chamber had become a battlefield of wills. Valor, standing with the pride of a leader who had once known no equal, was now cornered by his own actions. The Valorians had played the game of manipulation so expertly that Maya and her team had only now begun to see the full scope of the trap they had fallen into. It wasn't just about uncovering the past anymore, it was about whether that truth would ever see the light of day. The Valorians had a history of erasure, of rewriting their past, of burying the sins of their ancestors beneath layers of lies. And now, with their empire teetering on the brink, they would do whatever it took to bury the truth once again. Maya's pulse raced as she felt the weight of their situation. Her instincts had been correct. This was not a moment of diplomacy, not a moment of peaceful reconciliation. This was a test of something far more profound, the choice between truth and power. The Valorians, desperate to protect their empire, had decided to make that choice for them. Maya could feel it in the air, the quiet menace that hummed beneath the surface. The truth, now revealed, was at risk of being silenced forever. It was no longer just about exposing the Valorians' past, it was about whether the galaxy would ever learn the real story, the story of betrayal, of destruction, of the price of survival. You've seen too much, Valor's voice cut through the silence, his tone no longer the hesitant, remorseful voice of a leader confronting the sins of his people, but the stern, commanding voice of someone who knew what was at stake. The galaxy cannot know what you have uncovered. It will destroy everything we've built. You cannot expose this, Dr. Blackwood. Not now, not ever. His words hung in the air like a threat. There was no more pretense, no more talk of reconciliation. The Valorians were prepared to do anything to protect their empire, even if it meant silencing those who had dared to uncover the truth. It was a grim realization for Maya, one that shook her to the core. The Valorians had used their power, their influence, to keep the galaxy in the dark for centuries. They had manipulated history, twisted it to fit their narrative, and now they were prepared to bury the truth in the same way. But Maya couldn't back down, not now. She had seen the devastation their lies had caused. She had felt the weight of the galaxy's ignorance, of the species who had been deceived by the Valorians' false narrative. The truth had already started to unfold, and no matter what Valor said, no matter what threats he made, it was no longer just about the Valorians and their empire. It was about humanity's place in the galaxy. It was about the choices they would make in the face of overwhelming power and influence. Valor, Maya's voice was steady, but it carried a deep sense of conviction. You've made your choice. But I will not let you make it for the rest of us. Her eyes burned with determination, the quiet rage of someone who had seen too many lies, too many betrayals, to remain silent now. The truth will be known. No matter the cost. Valor's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The Valorians had never considered a species like humanity a true threat. They had dismissed them as weak, unworthy of even a second thought. But now, in the face of Maya's unyielding resolve, they were beginning to realize that humanity was not like the others. They were not going to fall in line or retreat in the face of overwhelming power. Humanity had been underestimated, and Valor's cold, calculating nature had misread the strength of the human spirit. You think you can just expose everything and walk away? Valor scoffed, his voice thick with contempt. The consequences will be catastrophic. Not just for us, but for all of you. If the truth comes to light, you will be implicated. You will be seen as the ones who tore apart the galaxy's fragile peace. You will be blamed for the unraveling of everything we've worked for. His words stung, but Maya refused to let them take root. She had spent years uncovering the truths of the galaxy's forgotten civilizations, piecing together stories that had been lost to time. But this was different. This was not just academic knowledge, this was a question of moral responsibility. What good was knowledge if it was buried in fear? What good was truth if it was hidden away to protect an empire built on lies? Maya's gaze hardened as she faced the High Commissioner. No, Valor, she said, her voice low but unwavering. The consequences are already here. You've lived in fear of the truth for far too long. But this is not your secret to keep anymore. It never was. The galaxy deserves to know who you really are, what you've really done. In that moment, a new kind of understanding passed between them, though it was far from agreement. Maya saw something flicker behind Valor's eyes, something raw and unspoken. A deep, hidden regret that ran so deep it had been buried under layers of pride and arrogance. And though the Valorians had tried to suppress it for centuries, the truth was starting to break through. Maybe you're right, Valor said quietly, his voice strained, the weight of his own words catching him off guard. Maybe it's time for the galaxy to know. Maybe it's time to stop running. But as the words left his mouth, it was clear that his decision had not been made in the spirit of change. It had been made out of necessity. The Valorians could not keep hiding anymore. The truth was out, and they were left with no choice but to face it. But that did not mean they would make it easy. The silence in the room stretched on as the weight of the decision settled over them. This was no longer a battle between two species, it was a reckoning. The Valorians had been exposed, their dark past laid bare for the galaxy to see. But in exposing their truth, they had also exposed themselves, showing a weakness they had spent millennia hiding from. And in the face of that weakness, Maya knew that humanity had a choice, one that would define the future. Would they allow the Valorians to bury the truth once again? Or would they stand firm and demand a new future, one where the truth, no matter how painful, was allowed to shape the galaxy? Maya turned to her team, her resolve solidifying. "We'll expose it," she said quietly, but with the strength of someone who had already made her decision. "The truth cannot be hidden anymore. And we will be the ones to make sure it's known." The road ahead would be perilous, but in that moment, Maya knew one thing for sure: humanity had taken its first step towards something far greater than survival. They had chosen to stand for something that transcended power or dominance. They had chosen the truth. And that, she believed, was the only thing that could set them free. The truth was no longer a secret, it had spilled into the galaxy, raw and unrelenting, a torrent that could not be controlled. The Valorians, once the undisputed rulers of the stars, now found themselves exposed, not just for their betrayal, but for the dark truth that had fueled their empire. What had been whispered in hushed corners of the galaxy for centuries was now laid bare for all to see. And humanity, the species they had once mocked, now stood as the bearers of that truth, not as outsiders, but as leaders in a new chapter of galactic history. In the days that followed the exposure of the Valorian secrets, the galaxy trembled. The vast networks of political alliances that had been built upon the illusion of Valorian supremacy began to shift. Empires that had once bowed to the Valorians now found themselves questioning their allegiance. The fragile peace that had been maintained for millennia on the foundation of Valorian dominance began to crumble, leaving in its wake a world, no, a galaxy, reeling from the shockwaves of revelation. Humanity, in the wake of this upheaval, found itself standing at the center of a storm. It was not the storm of war or conflict, though there were those who whispered of such things. It was the storm of change, a change that was as inevitable as it was necessary. For too long, the galaxy had lived in the shadow of lies, and now, for the first time, the truth was being allowed to rise to the surface. For the Valorians, this was a moment of reckoning. The High Commissioner Valor, once a figure of untouchable authority, was now a man broken by the weight of his own empire's sins. He had revealed the truth, but it was no longer something he could control. The very foundation of his people's existence, built on the bones of a species they had destroyed, was crumbling. And as it did, so too did the empire they had created. The walls that had held the galaxy's faith in Valorian superiority began to crumble, and with them, the confidence they had once exuded faded into something far more fragile: fear. The fear of what would happen when the galaxy saw them not as gods, but as the survivors of a crime too terrible to comprehend. For humanity, the choice had already been made. There was no turning back. The truth had been uncovered, and now it was up to them to decide what to do with it. Maya Blackwood, the scholar who had unwittingly opened the door to the Valorian past, stood at the forefront of this new era. She had seen what the truth had done to the Valorians, and in the faces of the galaxy's representatives, she saw the same fear that had once plagued Valor. Fear of losing control. Fear of facing the past. Fear of what might come next. Yet, in that fear, there was something else. There was hope. Humanity, with its resilience and its drive to uncover the truth, had become the unexpected leader of a new movement. The galaxy, for all its complexity and ancient histories, had forgotten the power of transparency, the power of honesty. And now, as the dust settled, it was clear that humanity had brought something to the table that no other species could claim, a commitment to truth, no matter the cost. As the weeks passed, the political landscape shifted. The Valorians, weakened by their own revelations, could no longer maintain the control they once had. Empires that had been too afraid to challenge them now found themselves re-evaluating their alliances, questioning their place in a galaxy that had been so long dominated by a single, deceptive narrative. The delicate peace that had been held together by the Valorians' influence was now under threat. But it was a threat born not of violence, but of possibility. The galaxy, once bound by fear and control, now found itself on the precipice of change. And humanity, for the first time, had the opportunity to lead it. Maya knew that this was no small task. The galaxy was vast, filled with species whose interests had been shaped by centuries of Valorian dominance. To step into the void left by the crumbling empire was no easy feat. It would require more than just the unveiling of the truth, it would require a new vision for the future, a vision that included every species, every corner of the galaxy. It would require humanity to be more than just a bystander in the grand story of the universe. It would require them to lead, to guide the galaxy toward a future built on cooperation, transparency, and mutual respect. In the days that followed the exposure of the Valorian secrets, humanity began to take the first steps toward this future. Diplomatic channels that had once been closed to them were now wide open. The once dismissed humans were now being sought after by other galactic powers, eager to hear their vision for the future. The galaxy, which had once looked down upon them as a fledgling species, now turned its eyes to them with a mix of admiration and curiosity. For the first time in history, humanity was not just another species in the galaxy, they were the leaders of a new era. Maya Blackwood, standing at the head of humanity's delegation, knew the road ahead would not be easy. There were forces in the galaxy that would never accept the changes that were coming. There would be those who would fight to keep the old order in place, who would attempt to bury the truth once again, who would challenge humanity's rise to power. But Maya had seen the power of the truth, and she knew it could not be suppressed forever. The galaxy had learned something that could never be unlearned. The Valorians, for all their power and all their lies, were not the galaxy's true leaders. Humanity had the chance to become something more, something better. And with that, the future of the galaxy began to shift. Humanity's leadership was not based on military might or the dominance of a single species. It was based on the strength of their convictions, on their ability to stand firm in the face of overwhelming opposition, and on their willingness to expose the truth no matter the consequences. They had not just uncovered the past, they had set the stage for a future where the galaxy would finally be able to move forward, free from the shadow of deceit and betrayal. As Maya stood in the council chambers, now filled with representatives from all corners of the galaxy, she knew that humanity had already won. Not through force or power, but through the unwavering strength of their belief in truth, in the power of transparency, and in the possibility of a better future for all. The galaxy was watching, and humanity was leading them into it, step by step, one truth at a time. In the end, it was not the Valorians who had shaped the future of the galaxy. It was humanity, those who had once been considered the underdogs, the weak, the unworthy. It was humanity that had taken the lead, and in doing so, had given the galaxy a chance at something greater than it had ever known. The events that unfolded, from the exposure of the Valorians' dark past to humanity's unyielding stand for truth, changed the course of the galaxy forever. It was not a battle fought with weapons, nor was it a conflict rooted in ancient grudges. Instead, it was a confrontation built on a single, unshakable principle, the power of truth. What humanity had uncovered was not just a hidden history, but a key to a future that could no longer be defined by fear, deception, or the weight of the past. In the aftermath of the revelation, the galaxy began to shift. The Valorians, once supreme and untouchable, found themselves standing in the ashes of their empire, struggling to reconcile the lies that had sustained their rule. Their long-held sense of superiority was shattered, leaving them vulnerable in a way they had never anticipated. Yet, as their empire crumbled, something new emerged, the promise of redemption. Humanity, despite all its flaws and past struggles, became the beacon of change. It was no longer about domination, but about forging a path forward, where the truth could lead to healing and unity, even in the face of immense opposition. Maya Blackwood, standing at the center of this new chapter, understood the responsibility placed on humanity's shoulders. This was not the end of their journey, but the beginning of something far greater, something that would demand courage, wisdom, and resilience. The galaxy was no longer a place divided by old alliances and secrets. It was a space where new possibilities could take root, where the future would be shaped by those who dared to lead with integrity. As humanity stepped into the light, they didn't just inherit the galaxy, they redefined it. They proved that even the darkest truths could become the foundation of a brighter future, and that through truth, courage, and unity, even the most fractured civilizations could rise again. The galaxy had been changed, and humanity had shown the way.